Hi everyone, welcome to week 14. We're getting so close to the end of this course. You must be excited. So today we're going to talk about the build up to the Civil War. And mainly we're going to be discussing between the years 1848 and 1861. So first I do want to talk a little bit about California and what was going on in our lovely state before the Civil War. So, as you probably know, we had a gold rush here, where in 1848 on the American River, James Marshall discovered gold, and he was working on a guy named John Sutter's camp. And so 1 year later, it took a while because of secrecy and, word of this could only travel so quickly. But a year later, about 55,000 49ers made their way to California. A lot of them taking the overland trail, especially if they were from the United States, but some of them did travel either through Panama or all the way around the tip of South America. So about 25,000 came by ship. And the population of California in 1848 was about 14,000. The following year, it had jumped up to 100,000, and by 1860, there were about 380,000 people living in California. And not all of them came over for gold. So if you've taken a California history class, you may have heard this term, mining the miners. And this includes people who came over during the gold rush, but to take advantage of gold miners. So shopkeepers, various professionals offering their services, gambling establishments, prostitutes, all coming over to take advantage of the gold miners. So that accounted for the population boom as well. About 80% of them were people from the U.S. who considered themselves Native Americans, which is a little ironic. And they started, well, they came over with prejudice from foreigners, especially with their own lack of success in the mines. They would start blaming others. So for example, especially after people from Oregon started coming over, familiar with their own genocidal activities up there, more and more people started hunting Native Americans, Native Californians for sport. There was mob violence toward Mexicans who came for the gold rush, or who were already living there because California was part of Mexico. And Chinese faced maybe the worst racism during the gold rush, violence, being driven out of camps, and a lot of the time they were hired from, like, in groups, being paid wages to go over and mine gold, and the wages were so low that they were basically not earning anything, so it was almost like slave labor for them. African Americans eventually were declared unable to work in the mines. They were determined that they were unwelcome, and they were non-citizens. So the gold mines did end up getting taken over heavily by U.S. Americans. There was some room for women during the gold rush, and there were some highly valued services that they could provide, including cooking, sewing, washing, childcare, and definitely sex. They made a lot of money with prostitution. So they went to make money. Some of them came over to California to have adventure, and many of them, not a ton, but some came over with their husbands for the adventure as well and to help make money. Eventually, these large corporations moved in with their machinery, caused a lot of environmental damage, but once the easy pickings were gone with the gold, these machines came in and with their corporations, and it started being taken over by that. I do want to talk about migration from China. So around this time, there was economic depression and revolts in China, and emigration to California for them was fairly easy compared to other locations. And there was also gold in California, so that was a lure, of course. So between 1849 and 54, about 45,000 migrants came from China. Only about 16 of the 45,000 of these migrants were women. So heavily male-dominated migration. When harassment in the gold mines intensified, Chinese migrants started turning to other sources of income, so opening laundries, restaurants, heavily participating in fishing operations. And as immigration expanded for the Chinese, anti-Chinese sentiments got way worse, leading to an eventual Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, prohibiting them from immigrating. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Mexican-American land disputes. So as we've talked about, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, but that had technically guaranteed Mexican Americans the free enjoyment of their liberty and their property. But it was a very vague statement, so it gave no framework for how they could prove that they owned property, and there really wasn't a good plan. So there were also these differences in legal culture, combined with racism, so that a lot of these Mexican Californians ended up being dispossessed of their land and impoverished. So it really didn't work out well. We have this California Land Act in 1851, which was trying to resolve this problem. It required anyone with Spanish or Mexican-era land claims to document them within 2 years. And the problem with this was that it took sometimes longer than 2 years to prove this. It was very expensive. It involved traveling to San Francisco with paperwork. A lot of people didn't have paperwork, or it was paperwork that didn't meet the needs of the United States but had fulfilled requirements for Mexico. And this isn't just in California, this is similar in all of the previously Mexican territories. It became a big situation. Like, they just, a lot of the time, couldn't prove that they owned land. And what would end up happening is they would end up working for wages for someone else on land that they had once owned. This was quite unfair, unfortunately. Okay, so we have this Compromise of 1850, which is a result of this debate. What needed to happen with regards to slavery in these newly acquired Mexican territories. So the Compromise stated that California would be a free state, and then it divided the Utah and New Mexico territories with a concept called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that the federal government would not determine it, but it would allow those territories to decide and vote on it for themselves whether or not they would allow slavery. So it did calm a lot of people's fears about what would happen, but now that California was admitted as a free state, there were more free states than slave states, so that did upset the South. Another legislation passed in 1850 was that the slave trade was ended in Washington, D.C., only in D.C., and in compromise to that, it established a more rigorous fugitive slave law. And the North claimed to be appalled by the fugitive slave law. A lot of them were, but they did still assist in the capture of enslaved people who had run away. It also denied trial by jury and required all citizens to assist in the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. So people, if they were summoned to come help search for somebody, for example, they would be required to do so. Okay. My favorite subject almost ever is trains. So in 1840, railroads started becoming the driving force for U.S. economic growth. In 1850, there were 9,000 miles of track in the U.S. By 1860, over 30,000 miles, which was more than the rest of the world had combined. And mostly this was paid for by federal and state aid. And this was done largely by mortgaging or selling land to farmers. And for farmers, this would be ideal to get land that was near a railroad. And so they would buy up that land and it would help pay for the railroad itself. And so this really established railroads and further settlement in the western United States. Farmers were able to sell more goods and sell them farther away for more money with the land they were acquiring near the railroads. And so this also, not only stimulated farming, but also the mining and the iron industries and the lumber industries, all used in building tracks and building the whole railway system. So one outcome of this is that it shifted the direction of trade. So steamboats and shipping and various types of overland shipping all took a hit because of this. So steamboats especially, they would ship goods from north to south, largely through the Mississippi River. And a reason why they were unreliable was that in the summer, the low water made using steamboats risky because they would scrape on the bottom with the low water. And then in the winter, the ice on the river often stopped traffic, so it was not reliable. Trains solved those problems. And so it did shift the direction of trade because we weren't just relying on north to south sort of trade. We were using trains to go all over the country. And this alienated the South further, in addition to what was going on with slavery. Chicago became the main hub for the rail system, connecting farms and rural areas to major cities. So the traffic definitely shifted from north and south to west and south, and west and north as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about immigration. So the surge of industry in the U.S. required a larger labor force. And between 1845 and 54, we have the largest surge of immigrants in U.S. history. Part of this is due to the booming economy. Part of this was due to this concept of freedom in the United States. Another factor here is the potato famine that occurred in Ireland between 1845 and 52. About a third of the population of Ireland was almost entirely dependent on potatoes. And when this famine hit, of the 9 million or so people in Ireland, about 1 million of them died, and another 1.5 million fled Ireland. And about 2/3 of those who fled ended up coming to the United States. And they were typically working in factories for very low wages. And not just the Irish workers, but all of these immigrants that were coming over during this time started forming communities in urban areas. And this is where people start talking about urban slums, where we have these large communities of people working for very low wages, where crime starts to pick up. A lot of people are heavily drinking, and those kind of go hand in hand. So it became really hard for families. It started causing some racism in those areas. It also started having this where the middle class would start leaving the urban centers and pushing their way out to the outskirts of cities. Okay, I think I'm going to pause there and we'll get to a part 2 in just a moment.